Hi, my name is Nate Swart. I work for Acquia in the Professional Services Department, and I wanted to share with you a module I've been working on called Project QA that should help you assess how your project's going, where it's come from, and all of those good things. Most modules you can install through the module admin screen within the Drupal admin. However, Project QA requires you to utilize Drush to enable it because it does require the Composer Manager module, which will only auto-detect the dependencies through Drush. As you can see, I've set up a Drupal sandbox here to play with. Got a plain, empty Drupal site waiting. The only module I've popped on here is Project QA, but I have not enabled it yet. So we'll just go ahead and do that. So it's going to download a couple of the extra dependency it has, like entity module. There is a number of custom entities included in this to help manage your database tables for you. Now, out of the box, the way it stands right now, this module just sets up the framework for us to use. There is another included module, submodule within Project QA called Project QA PHP LOC. And what that does is exposes the PHP LOC library to Project QA in order to actually get some data from your project. We'll go into more details on submodules later, but for now, we'll just enable this module as well. And this is where the dependencies start to come in a lot more directly. You'll see it's going to get the Composer module, and then it's actually going to go and using Composer, going to download PHP LOC from GitHub. Don't be surprised if this takes a few seconds on your local machine. I actually skipped the video ahead because it was just sitting there processing for a little bit. And there we go. Now we are all set to start using Project QA. Let me show you what it does. The only real configuration that needs to be done for Project QA is to tell it which repositories it's going to be tracking. We'll do that in the database table directly for right now. I'll be creating a UI at some point in the future. You see here the project QA underscore repo table, and all it's going to look for is we got to give it a name, the URL to the Git repository location, and which branch it's going to be tracking. Let's start by looking at the Entity API. It's a slightly smaller module with not as many commits, so it should process a little faster for this demo. Go to the version control tab, get the repo URL, and notice what the branch is. And there we have it. We should be all set to start processing this repository. Just like the install procedure, Project QA needs to actually be executed from the command line using Drush. It's a very simple command, drush pqa, and what it's going to do is look up to see in the table that it needs to get the Entity API, reach out to the repo location, clone it locally, and then start processing it commit by commit. It's going to be walking the repo as it's named here. And what that means is that it's going to check out, starting at head, every commit in the repo's history. And then at each commit, it's going to fire a hook. Now, the Project QA PHP LOC submodule implements that hook. So it gets the notification that now it's its turn to go in and go ahead and process. While we're letting that process, let's head over to the PHP LOC homepage on GitHub to see what exactly the kind of information we're going to get from PHP LOC. If we scroll down to the README area, we'll notice that if we were to execute this from the command line, this is the sort of output it would give us. Number of directories, number of files, lines of code, a whole slew of information about our project. Now I'm calling PHP LOC directly, it's not writing out to the command line or to a file, so it helps speed things up a little bit, especially as we're processing as much data as every single commit in a repo's history. One piece of information that's not quite as obvious is what cyclomatic complexity is. That's basically a measurement of how many different ways a piece of code would need to be executed to see every path through that code. A simple function would just have one, However, if you had an if statement, for instance, that could start branching out to a couple different ways to get through that code depending on what the variables were driving it. You start introducing switch statements, complicated for each with their own branching, and then even extra function calls. You can see how that can get complicated pretty quickly. The cyclomatic complexity measurements that are here in this project are divided by the number of lines, logical lines of code, or the number of methods to kind of give you an idea as to how complicated the average method is versus how complicated each individual line of code is. And these are really good to kind of give you an idea of, relatively speaking, how complicated is one section of code versus another section of code, or one project versus another project. And fast forward to the end, you see it's finished processing everything here. The last thing it does is walking tags. And what that means is it's actually going in and pulling out all the tags that have been set on this repository and matching them up with the Git commits that have already been imported so that we have a record if we want to do reporting based on tags as well. Now, the other thing to note is that if we were to run this again, it's not actually going to go through this entire process because it's already imported these 496 commits. It remembers which commits it's done. It does a quick diff and says, oh, I've actually got nothing else to walk through, so it finishes rather quickly. This is going to make moving forward a lot easier after you get your projects initially imported. Let's head over to the database here again just to see what's been tracked. If we go to the Project QA Git commit table, you see in here we're keeping track of what the hash was, the project that it maps to, the timestamp. Now this is not the timestamp that it was imported into the database, but the timestamp that the commit actually occurred, and then the author of that commit. You see here with Git tags, the different tags that have been set. This column has not been completed yet. It's just a placeholder for future functionalities. And then which Git commit it actually maps to. Now the PHP LOC submodule tracks a little bit more. This is where you start getting a lot of extra data. You can see we just got columns after columns of data in here, depending on what you'd like to do. Part of this module, it also calculates a delta. If you're more interested in just changes that happen from commit to commit and don't really care about the values themselves, you can start seeing things that kind of show up a little bit more out of the mainstream. And sometimes this can help you identify issues or things you need to investigate a little bit more. Included in the Project QA PHP LOC submodule are two views to get you started on how to use some of this information: the project complexity and top contributors views. They're not enabled by default, but if you enable them, you will see them. Project complexity shows you information surrounding the cyclomatic complexity computations that were done by PHP LOC. And again, if you're interested in more details on exactly what that is, definitely check out the Development by the Numbers presentation at DrupalCon Portland. This view is going to list all the separate repositories you're tracking and then sort them by default by the cyclomatic complexity divided by the logical lines of code and the cyclomatic complexity as by the number of methods. It also shows you the last recorded commit that it has currently imported. Top contributors shows you all the commit authors as they appear across all the projects you're tracking, and then it shows you the delta information. So this isn't an absolute number of the lines of code that they've contributed, but just how many lines of code they've changed. If you head over to the Project QA demo site, you'll notice that I've got the same basic setup here with the default views of project complexity and top contributors. But what I've done is added a few extra modules in the mix to show you what else you can do. We'll check out the Project QA repo. Now, just by adding panels and Google Chart tools to the mix, you can start to see a much easier to digest history of what's going on in your project. For instance, if you come down here to complexity, I note that right around this time, I started refactoring some of the code to make it a little bit more streamlined, and you can see how it's actually coming down in complexity and becoming easier to maintain. Similarly, with top contributors, I've linked to a detail page for each one. We'll check my page out, and you can see the only project that I'm tracking that I've contributed to is the Project QA repo. And here's a couple points that we may want to investigate. Why is it that I introduced that much delta during these two commits? Was it something that is acceptable, or is it something that needs to be refactored further? Perhaps this actually lines up with the timescale of when I did the refactoring, and actually these are good deltas to know about. That's it for now. Hope you find this useful. If you end up putting this into use somewhere, please let me know. Let me know what else would work for you and any new functionality you'd like to see. Thanks a lot.